Imagine you're a farmer in ancient China. The summer rain has just ended. Mist clings to the mountains. The earth is soft beneath your feet as you walk a narrow path between fields that your family has worked for generations. Then your shovel strikes something hard. Not stone, bone. You kneel down and brush away the soil. A curve appears. Then another. Then teeth. Huge teeth, far larger than any animal you have ever seen. The skeleton seems endless. Vertebrae emerge from the hillside one after another, like a buried serpent stretching deep into the mountain itself. You have no word for dinosaur, no concept of extinction, no scientific framework to explain what lies beneath your feet. So what conclusion would you reach? For thousands of years, countless people across China face exactly this mystery, and many arrived at the same answer. They believed they found dragons, not symbols, not fairy tales, not imaginary monsters. Real dragons, living creatures that once roamed the earth. And that raises a question that historians, paleontologists, and storytellers still debate today. What if dragon legends were not created from pure imagination? What if some of the world's most enduring dragon stories began with real discoveries buried beneath the ground? Because when we picture dragons today, we usually imagine fantasy, fire, magic, winged beasts soaring across medieval skies. But Chinese dragons are different. They are older, stranger, and in many ways more believable. Unlike the dragons of European folklore, Chinese dragons were rarely depicted as evil creatures waiting to be slain. They were forces of nature, controllers of rivers and storms, beings associated with mountains, clouds, rainfall, and the very structure of the cosmos. Most importantly, people often spoke about them as though they were real animals, creatures that lived in remote lakes, creatures seen emerging from rivers after floods, creatures whose bones could still be found in the earth. That last detail is where our mystery truly begins. Because for centuries, villages throughout China collected what they called dragon bones. These bones were ground into medicine, stored in temples, displayed as sacred relics, passed from generation to generation. The remarkable part? Many of those dragon bones were real fossils. Some belonged to ancient mammals. Others belonged to giant prehistoric reptiles. A few came from animals so enormous that even modern scientists stand in awe when their remains emerge from the ground. Suddenly the question changes. Perhaps the mystery is not why people believed in dragons. Perhaps the mystery is why they wouldn't. Imagine discovering the skull of a gigantic creature unlike anything alive. Imagine uncovering a rib taller than a man. Imagine finding a spine stretching across a hillside. Without paleontology, without museums, without textbooks explaining millions of years of evolution, what would such discoveries look like? To ancient eyes, they might look exactly like the remains of dragons. But fossils are only one piece of this puzzle, because there is another possibility, a far stranger one. Some researchers have wondered whether dragon legends may preserve distant memories of encounters with real animals, not dinosaurs. Human beings never lived alongside non-avian dinosaurs. The timelines simply do not match. Yet throughout Chinese history, people shared landscapes with creatures that could easily inspire dragon imagery. Massive crocodilians, enormous snakes, ancient alligators, gigantic fish, towering deer with branching antlers, even Ice Age megafauna whose bones occasionally surface from riverbanks and caves. Could fragments of these encounters have merged together across centuries? Could fossil discoveries, living animals and human imagination have combined to create the dragon we know today? The deeper we look, the more complicated the answer becomes. Because dragons appear almost everywhere in Chinese civilization. They coil across ancient jade carvings. They emerge from bronze vessels. They decorate imperial robes. They guard palaces. They inhabit poetry. They appear in records written by scholars who treated them not as myths, but as natural creatures worthy of observation. And yet the dragon itself constantly changes. Sometimes it resembles a serpent, sometimes a crocodile, sometimes a fish, sometimes a creature assembled from many animals at once. Each version leaves clues. Each transformation tells us something about the people who imagined it, and perhaps about the animals they encountered. What makes this investigation so fascinating is that it sits at the boundary between two worlds. One world belongs to mythology, the other belongs to paleontology. One is filled with gods, emperors, and legends. The other is filled with fossils, extinct species, and geological time. For generations, these worlds seem completely separate, but buried beneath Chinese soil, they begin to overlap. A dragon bone becomes a dinosaur fossil. A mountain legend becomes an archaeological clue. An ancient story suddenly points toward a real creature that once existed. And the further we follow these connections, the stranger they become. Because some of the most important dinosaur discoveries in human history were made in regions where dragon legends had existed for centuries. Some fossil beds were known long before scientists arrived. Local communities had already developed explanations for the enormous bones emerging from the ground. Explanations centered on dragons. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps something deeper was happening. A process repeated across thousands of years. People encountering evidence of lost worlds and trying to make sense of them. In this documentary, we will journey through ancient China to uncover the origins of one of humanity's most enduring creatures. We will follow dragon bones from remote mountain villages to imperial courts. We will examine the animals that may have inspired dragon sightings. We will explore how fossils shape belief, how belief shaped culture, and how culture preserved clues that survived for millennia. Along the way, we will encounter forgotten discoveries, surprising scientific evidence, and a mystery that remains unresolved even today. Because by the end of this story, the question will no longer be whether dragons existed. The real question is far more intriguing. When ancient Chinese people spoke of dragons, what exactly were they seeing? And what if the answer has been buried beneath our feet the entire time? Long before scientists dug carefully through fossil beds with brushes and notebooks, another kind of investigation was taking place across China. It happened in villages, on riverbanks, inside mountain caves, along windswept cliffs where strange bones emerged from the earth after storms. And unlike modern paleontologists, the people who found these remains were not trying to discover extinct species. They were trying to understand dragons. That distinction changes everything. Because to understand Chinese dragon lore, we first need to abandon a modern assumption. We tend to think of dragons as mythical by definition, creatures that everyone knows are fictional. But for much of Chinese history, the line between myth and reality was far less clear. Many people genuinely believed dragons existed, not somewhere beyond the world, within it. The dragon was not merely a character in stories. It was woven into the fabric of reality itself. Rainfall depended on dragons. Floods reflected their anger. Drought suggested their absence. Entire communities organized rituals around maintaining harmony with these unseen powers. And unlike many supernatural beings, dragons were thought to leave evidence behind. Tracks appearances, bones, sometimes even bodies. Imagine standing beside a river after weeks of relentless rain. The current churns violently. Trees are uprooted. Fields disappear beneath muddy water. Then villagers report seeing something enormous moving through the flood. A long shape twisting beneath the surface. A dark body vanishing into the mist. Today we might suspect floating debris, an unusually large fish, or a trick of perspective. But in a world where dragons were already accepted as part of nature, the conclusion often seemed obvious. A dragon had passed through. Stories like these accumulated over centuries. A sighting in one province, a discovery in another, a strange skeleton found hundreds of miles away. Each account reinforced the next. The dragon became not just a legend but a category of creature, something expected, something plausible, something that belonged within the natural order. And then there was the emperor. Perhaps nowhere is this belief more visible than at the very center of Chinese civilization. The dragon was not feared as a monster. It was revered as a symbol of supreme authority. The emperor himself became associated with the dragon. His throne was known as the dragon throne. His robes carried dragon imagery. His power was connected to heavenly order, and dragons were among the most powerful symbols of that cosmic balance. Think about what that means. A civilization does not place an imaginary beast at the center of political authority by accident. The dragon represented something profound. Strength without chaos. Power without destruction. a force that connected heaven, earth, and humanity. Yet even here, a contradiction emerges. The imperial dragon was majestic and divine. The dragons described in local records often sounded surprisingly physical. They occupied rivers, lakes, mountains, forest-specific places, places people could visit, places where unusual discoveries occurred. It is as though two versions of the dragon existed simultaneously, one symbolic, one tangible, one belonging to heaven, the other seemingly rooted in the earth itself. And occasionally, those two versions collided. Ancient chronicles contain accounts that modern readers find startling. There are reports of dragons falling from the sky, dragons washing ashore after storms, dragons found dead in fields. Some records describe villagers gathering around these creatures, observing their bodies in remarkable detail. Scales, claws, whiskers, serpentine forms. At first glance, these stories seem impossible, yet they reveal something important. The writers often treated dragons as zoological subjects rather than purely supernatural beings. They described them with the same matter-of-fact tone used for unusual animals. Not everyone accepted every report. Skepticism existed, debate existed, but belief remained widespread. This is the world into which our mystery emerges. Because once people believe dragons are real, every unusual discovery becomes potential evidence, especially bones. And bones were appearing everywhere. Across northern and central China, erosion constantly exposed fossil-rich layers hidden beneath the soil. Heavy rain stripped away sediment. Riverbanks collapsed. Hillsides cracked open. What emerged often defied explanation. Massive vertebrae, gigantic limb bones, fragments of skulls unlike any living creature. Sometimes entire skeletons appeared. To modern paleontologists, such finds are invaluable scientific treasures. To ancient villagers, they were something else entirely. Dragon remains. The phrase appears again and again throughout historical records. Dragon bones, dragon teeth, dragon skeletons. The terminology was so widespread that it eventually became part of traditional medicine. For centuries, fossilized bones were collected and sold under the name dragon bones. Ground into powder, they were believed to possess healing properties. The irony is extraordinary. Some of the fossils that would later transform our understanding of prehistoric life were literally being crushed into medicine. Imagine holding a dinosaur bone in your hand, a relic from a creature that lived tens of millions of years before humanity existed. Now imagine having no idea what a dinosaur is. What explanation would make more sense? An extinct reptile from deep geological time, or the remains of a dragon? The answer seems obvious. Yet this creates a fascinating paradox. Chinese civilization may have been interacting with dinosaur fossils for thousands of years without recognizing them as dinosaurs. Instead, those discoveries entered folklore, religion, medicine, art, and collective memory. The fossils did not disappear. They were absorbed into culture. That process may be one of the most important clues in our entire investigation, because dragon imagery itself begins evolving in curious ways. The earliest dragon depictions do not always resemble the dragons familiar today. Ancient jade carvings from prehistoric cultures show elongated, serpent-like forms. Simple, curving, almost abstract. As centuries pass, new features appear. Antlers, claws, whiskers, scales. The dragon becomes increasingly complex. An amalgamation of many creatures. Part snake, part deer, part fish, part bird, part predator. Why? One explanation is symbolic evolution. Different regions contributed different traditions. Different animals inspired different features. But another possibility lurks beneath the surface. What if unusual fossil discoveries occasionally influence these transformations? A skull found in one valley, a vertebra uncovered in another, a gigantic claw emerging from a mountainside. Each discovery adding new details to the imagined creature. No single fossil would create the dragon, but thousands of discoveries across thousands of years, that is a different story entirely. And this brings us to another mystery, because dragons were not uniquely Chinese. Dragon-like creatures appear across cultures around the world. Mesopotamia, India, Europe, the The Americas. Why do so many civilizations imagine giant reptilian beings? Some scholars argue that dragons emerged naturally from universal human fears. Predators, snakes, large carnivores, danger hidden in the wilderness. Others suspect fossils may have played a role in many regions. Ancient people repeatedly encountered evidence of giant unknown creatures buried beneath the earth. Without modern science, myths fill the gap. The debate continues. But China presents perhaps the strongest case of all. Why? Because nowhere else do we find such a long, continuous tradition linking dragons directly to physical bones. Not stories alone. Bones. Actual objects people could touch, collect, trade, and examine. That connection transforms dragons from purely mythological beings into something more complex. A cultural interpretation of real evidence. Evidence whose true nature remained hidden. For now, because the story is about to take a dramatic turn. For centuries, dragon bones remained dragon bones. Then a new kind of investigator arrived. An investigator carrying a radically different idea. What if those enormous skeletons did not belong to dragons at all? What if they belonged to creatures far older than any legend? Creatures from a lost world buried beneath China itself? And once that possibility emerged, the dragon mystery became even stranger than anyone had imagined. The first person to identify a dinosaur bone never knew what a dinosaur was. For thousands of years, people walked across fossil fields without realizing they were standing atop entire vanished worlds. And nowhere was this more true than China. Because while Europe would eventually become famous for launching modern paleontology, China possessed something even more remarkable. It possessed the fossils themselves. Vast numbers of them. Entire landscapes filled with the remains of prehistoric giants. The bones had always been there. The mystery was how people interpreted them. Imagine standing in the rugged hills of northern China centuries ago. The land is dry and wind-carved. Layer upon layer of exposed rock stretches toward the horizon. Rainstorms occasionally rip open the earth, revealing pale shapes embedded in the cliffs. Some resemble ribs. Others look like enormous joints. Still others appear almost artificial, as if they were carved by human hands. Yet they are undeniably natural, ancient, and immense. For local communities, these discoveries were familiar. Many regions developed reputations as places where dragon remains could be found. Certain mountains became associated with dragons. Certain caves gained legendary status. Certain valleys were known for producing strange bones after storms. The landscape itself became part of mythology, and in an unexpected way, the mythology preserved real geological knowledge. Generation after generation remembered where dragon bones appeared. They passed that information to their children, their grandchildren, their descendants. What they were actually preserving were maps to fossil deposits. Without realizing it, they were cataloging paleontological sites. That fact would become incredibly important centuries later. But first, we need to understand the scale of what lay hidden beneath these mountains. Because China's fossil record is extraordinary. Some of the most significant dinosaur discoveries ever made have emerged from Chinese soil. Towering sauropods, armored dinosaurs, feathered dinosaurs, ancient crocodilians, marine reptiles, flying reptiles, entire ecosystems frozen in stone. Today we know these animals lived across different periods, separated by millions of years. Ancient observers could not know that. To them, all these bones emerged from the same earth. A gigantic femur here, an enormous vertebra there. Fragments from creatures that had never actually lived together became mixed within human imagination. The result was something new, a composite creature assembled from evidence scattered across time itself. In other words, something remarkably similar to a dragon. Think about the anatomy of the traditional Chinese dragon. A long serpentine body, powerful claws, horn-like antlers, a fierce head, scales, sometimes a mane, sometimes whiskers. It is not a copy of any single animal. It is an assemblage, a creature built from many parts. At first glance, this seems purely symbolic, but fossils create a curious possibility. Imagine discovering isolated bones from different prehistoric species over many generations. No complete skeleton, no scientific framework, just fragments, a giant spine, a massive skull, an unusual claw, a horned structure, a strange jaw. Could those discoveries gradually influence the image of an already existing mythical creature? Could fossil evidence add details to dragon lore over time? We cannot prove it happened, but the possibility is difficult to ignore, especially because ancient Chinese texts repeatedly connect dragons with places rich in fossils. Again and again, dragons seem to inhabit landscapes where enormous bones emerge from the ground. The overlap is striking. And then there is the medicine. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. For centuries, dragon bones became valuable commodities. Merchants collected them. Physicians prescribed them. Apothecaries stored them in jars. Entire trade networks developed around fossilized remains. The bones were ground into powder and incorporated into traditional remedies. To modern eyes, the practice appears tragic. Countless scientifically important fossils were destroyed. Yet from another perspective, those bones survived precisely because people valued them. Had they been considered worthless rocks, many would have vanished unnoticed. Instead, communities actively searched for them, protected them, collected them. In a strange twist of history, belief in dragons helped preserve evidence of prehistory. Then came a discovery that would change everything. Not because a new fossil was found, but because someone finally looked at an old one differently. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Western paleontology began spreading across Asia. Scientists arrived with unfamiliar ideas. They carried concepts that would have sounded astonishing to previous generations. Extinction, geological time, prehistoric life, dinosaurs. These ideas challenged assumptions that had endured for centuries. A dragon bone was no longer necessarily a dragon bone. It might be something far older, something stranger, something real in a completely different sense. The transition was not immediate. Many fossils remained classified according to traditional beliefs, but gradually a new interpretation emerged, and the results were astonishing. One of the most famous examples occurred through what appeared to be a routine purchase. Researchers examining traditional medicinal materials discovered that some dragon bones being sold in markets were actually fossil remains, not symbolic remains, not carved artifacts, genuine prehistoric fossils. Suddenly, scientists realized something extraordinary. The dragon bone trade might provide direct access to important fossil discoveries. The challenge was finding their source. Where were these bones coming from? Who was collecting them? What mountains concealed their origins? The search led investigators deep into regions where dragon legends had flourished for generations, and what they found exceeded expectations. Entire fossil-rich formations stretched across the landscape, places where villagers had been gathering dragon bones for centuries, places where enormous prehistoric skeletons still waited beneath the soil. The scientific discoveries that followed transformed paleontology. China emerged as one of the most important fossil-producing regions on Earth. But something curious happened along the way. The more scientists learned about dinosaurs, the less ridiculous the dragon legends appeared. Not because dragons were real, but because the observations behind the stories suddenly made sense. Imagine uncovering the vertebra of a giant sauropod. It is larger than a human head. Its shape is unlike anything living nearby. Its size implies a creature of staggering proportions. Now imagine trying to explain that discovery without science. The dragon hypothesis no longer seems irrational. It becomes understandable, perhaps even inevitable. This realization changed how many historians approached ancient dragon lore. The question was no longer whether people had mistaken fossils for dragon remains. That seemed increasingly likely. The more intriguing question became how often it happened. Was it occasional? Common? Widespread across entire regions? No one could say with certainty. But evidence continued accumulating, and the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the connections became. Because fossils alone cannot explain everything. Dragon legends often contain surprisingly specific behaviors. Swimming through rivers, dwelling in lakes, controlling storms, emerging from marshes, moving through clouds. Those details suggest something more than fossil discoveries. They suggest observation, memory, encounters with living creatures, which raises an even bigger question. If fossils helped shape the body of the dragon, what shaped its behavior? Because somewhere within China's vast landscapes lived animals so unusual, so powerful, and so dragon-like that they may have contributed their own features to the legend. Real creatures, creatures people could actually see. And when we begin searching for them, we discover that some are far stranger than fiction. The dragon bones may have come from the dead, but the next clues come from the living. A dragon skeleton buried in stone can explain a dragon's shape, but it cannot explain a dragon's behavior. Fossils do not swim through rivers. They do not rise from lakes. They do not vanish into mist. And yet, those are exactly the kind of stories that appear throughout Chinese history. Again and again, dragons are described as living creatures, not ancient remains, not relics, living beings moving through real landscapes. So, where did those stories come from? To answer that question, we have to leave the fossil beds behind and enter another world entirely, the world of memory. Because the dragon may not have been inspired by a single animal. It may have emerged from centuries of encounters with many different creatures, some familiar, some rare, some so extraordinary that they barely seem real even today. And once we begin examining them, something remarkable happens. The dragon starts to look less like an invention and more like a mosaic, a creature assembled from fragments of reality. Our first suspect lives in the water. Long before roads crossed much of China, rivers served as highways, lifelines, and boundaries. Entire civilizations developed along their banks. People spent their lives near water, fishing, trading, traveling, watching. And when people spend enough time around rivers, they begin noticing strange things, particularly large things. Imagine standing beside a broad river at dawn. The surface is calm. Fog drifts above the water. Then a long, dark shape breaks the surface. For a moment it appears snake-like. Then it disappears. The disturbance spreads outward. The water settles. Whatever was there is gone. Such experiences have occurred throughout human history. Most have ordinary explanations. Large fish, floating logs, unusual waves. Yet every culture accumulates stories about mysterious creatures inhabiting its waterways. China was no exception. In fact, some of its waterways contain animals that genuinely inspired awe. One of the most intriguing examples is the Chinese alligator. Today it is small compared to some of its relatives. Critically endangered and restricted to limited habitats, it appears almost fragile. But the modern animal represents only a remnant of a much older story. For thousands of years, larger crocodilian species inhabited parts of Asia. Their ancient relatives were formidable predators, powerful, armored, stealthy, perfectly adapted for ambush. Imagine encountering such an animal without understanding what it is. It remains motionless for hours, then suddenly explodes from the water. Its body is elongated, its scales gleam, its tail drives it through the river like a living serpent. Viewed briefly through mist or storm, it is easy to understand how imagination might take hold. Yet crocodilians explain only part of the dragon, because Chinese dragons are longer, more serpentine, more fluid. To find those features, we must look elsewhere, toward snakes. Large snakes have inspired fear and fascination across nearly every human society. They move differently from other animals. They seem to glide, to flow, to appear and disappear with uncanny ease. Ancient Chinese texts frequently associate dragons with winding movement, river-like forms, and sinuous bodies, characteristics that strongly resemble serpents. And while China lacks the giant constrictors found in some tropical regions, large snakes have long inhabited many parts of East Asia. An unexpected encounter could leave a powerful impression, particularly in eras when the natural world remained mysterious and unpredictable. But snakes alone cannot explain another distinctive dragon feature, the antlers. This detail may seem strange. After all, dragons are reptiles. Why would they possess antlers? The answer may reveal something important about how myths evolve. Because the dragon does not behave like a biological organism. It behaves like a cultural collage, a combination of admired traits gathered from many sources. And few animals inspired admiration more than deer. Ancient China was home to impressive deer species, including some with spectacular branching antlers. In forests shrouded with mist, these animals could appear almost supernatural, their silhouettes transformed by distance and light. Imagine seeing only a head emerge from reeds at dawn. The antlers spread outward like a crown. The animal disappears before you fully understand what you saw. The image lingers. Over generations, details migrate from one story to another. Eventually, the antlers belong not only to deer, they belong to dragons. This process may seem subtle, yet it happens constantly in folklore. Legends absorb reality. Reality reshapes legends. The two become inseparable. And then there are fish. This possibility often surprises modern audiences. Yet many traditional dragon depictions contain unmistakable aquatic features. Scale bodies, whisker-like barbels, elongated forms. Characteristics strongly associated with large freshwater fish, particularly carp and sturgeon. Consider the Chinese sturgeon, an ancient species whose lineage stretches back through immense spans of time. Its body appears almost prehistoric. Its armored form seems closer to a relic than a modern fish. A fisherman encountering a particularly large specimen centuries ago might describe it in ways that sound remarkably dragon-like. The same is true of giant carp, especially during spawning migrations when large numbers move through rivers in dramatic displays of power and motion. The famous legend of the carp transforming into a dragon after leaping a waterfall reveals how closely these creatures became linked within cultural imagination. But perhaps the most fascinating possibility involves animals that no longer exist. Not dinosaurs. Something closer to us in time. The great megafauna of the Ice Age. Throughout the last several 100,000 years, Asia hosted extraordinary creatures. Giant deer, ancient elephants, massive rhinoceroses, predators larger than those living today. Most vanished long before recorded history, yet their bones remained. Their occasional remains emerged from caves, riverbanks, and eroding hillsides. Sometimes entire skulls appeared, sometimes tusks, sometimes gigantic limb bones. These discoveries could blur the line between fossil and memory. A community finds enormous remains. Stories emerge to explain them. Generations repeat those stories. Eventually, the original animal disappears. But the narrative survives. Could fragments of extinct megafauna have contributed to dragon lore? Some researchers think so, not because people directly observed Ice Age giants, but because their remains continued influencing imagination long after the animals vanished. And this raises a profound question. How much of mythology represents remembered reality? Human beings are storytellers. We preserve information through narratives. Sometimes those narratives become distorted, sometimes symbolic, sometimes fantastical, yet they often contain kernels of truth hidden beneath layers of embellishment. A flood becomes a world-ending deluge. A ruler becomes a demigod. An unusual animal becomes a monster. Perhaps dragons followed a similar path. Perhaps generations of observations accumulated like sediment. A crocodilian here, a giant fish there, a snake, a deer, a fossil skeleton, an enormous bone, a strange sighting in fog, a dramatic encounter during a flood. Each story contributes something. Each generation adds another layer. Eventually, no one remembers the original pieces. Only the dragon remains. And yet, one mystery still refuses to disappear. Because dragons are not merely associated with rivers or forests. They are associated with power, weather, storms, the sky itself. Ancient accounts repeatedly describe dragons controlling rain and emerging from clouds. At first glance, this seems purely supernatural. But in the next chapter, we will encounter a surprising connection between real natural events and dragon sightings. A connection involving floods, storms, strange discoveries, and some of the most dramatic moments in the ancient world. Because sometimes the appearance of a dragon was not just a story. Sometimes it happened immediately after nature unleashed its full fury. And that may not be a coincidence. The dragon often appeared after a storm. At least, that is what the records seem to suggest. Again and again, ancient accounts describe dragons emerging during periods of dramatic weather. Floods, thunderstorms, river surges, landslides, moments when nature suddenly became violent and unpredictable. At first glance, this sounds exactly like mythology. Of course, a weather dragon appears during storms. That is what weather dragons do. But what if there was another reason? What if the storm itself was revealing something hidden? To understand this possibility, imagine a landscape transformed by rain. Days of relentless downpours have saturated the ground. Rivers burst their banks. Hillsides collapse. Entire sections of earth slide away. The terrain changes almost overnight. Then, when the storm finally passes, strange objects appear where none existed before. Massive bones protrude from cliffs. Gigantic vertebrae emerge from riverbanks. Ancient skeletons that have remained buried for millions of years suddenly become visible. To modern paleontologists, this process is familiar. Many important fossil discoveries occur after erosion exposes hidden remains. Nature does the excavation first. Humans simply notice the results. Ancient people witnessed exactly the same phenomenon. The difference was interpretation. A modern scientist sees a fossil bed. A farmer in the Han Dynasty might see evidence that a dragon has surfaced from beneath the earth. The physical event is identical. The meaning is entirely different. This may help explain one of the most persistent patterns in Chinese dragon lore: the close association between dragons and changing landscapes. Dragons appear near mountains, near rivers, near places where the earth itself seems alive. And in many cases, these are precisely the locations where fossils are most likely to emerge. The connection becomes even more intriguing when we consider how ancient people viewed the ground beneath their feet. Today we think of the earth as relatively stable. Ancient communities often saw it differently. The land could crack open without warning. Floodwaters could erase entire villages. Earthquakes could reshape valleys. To people living through such events, the earth was not passive. It was active, powerful, sometimes frightening. If enormous bones emerged from that living landscape, they naturally became part of the same story. The earth revealed dragons because dragons belong to the earth. Then something even stranger happens. Some historical accounts describe dragons that appear injured, dead, or trapped. This detail often gets overlooked, yet it may be one of the most important clues in our investigation. Think about it. A divine weather spirit should not wash ashore like a stranded animal. A supernatural being should not leave behind a decomposing body. And yet certain records describe exactly these scenarios. Villagers discover a dragon after storm. Officials inspect it. People gather to observe it. Descriptions are recorded. Sometimes offerings are made. Sometimes burial ceremonies take place. Modern readers usually dismiss these reports immediately, but perhaps we should pause before doing so. Because if people occasionally encountered the carcasses of unfamiliar animals, how would they interpret them? Especially if decomposition had altered their appearance. A whale stranded along the coast can look bizarre even to modern observers. A partially decomposed crocodilian can become almost unrecognizable. Floods transport animals far from their normal habitats. Storms reveal creatures rarely seen by humans. Ancient witnesses lacked field guides and biological databases. When faced with something extraordinary, they reached for the most extraordinary explanation available: the dragon. And there's another factor that makes storms particularly important: visibility, or rather, the lack of it. Mist, rain, dark clouds, distance. Human perception becomes unreliable under such conditions. Large objects appear larger. Movement seems stranger. Ordinary animals take on unusual shapes. Even today, eyewitness reports during extreme weather are notoriously difficult to interpret. Now place yourself in an ancient landscape where dragons are already accepted as real, where stories circulate constantly, where unusual bones emerge from the ground, where rivers and mountains are believed to house powerful creatures. Under those conditions, a fleeting glimpse through fog acquires enormous significance. The sighting reinforces a legend. The legend shapes future sightings. A feedback loop begins, and over centuries, the dragon grows stronger, not weaker. This process helps explain something fascinating about dragon lore. Unlike many mythical creatures, dragons never became obsolete. New evidence continually seemed to support their existence. A strange skeleton appears. A dragon. An unusual animal is discovered. A dragon. A flood uncovers giant bones. A dragon. Each event renews belief. Each discovery adds another layer to the narrative. The legend remains alive because the landscape keeps feeding it. Yet storms may have contributed more than isolated discoveries. They may have shaped entire traditions. Consider China's great rivers. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, waterways that periodically unleash catastrophic floods. For ancient communities, these floods were among the most powerful forces imaginable. They arrived suddenly, destroyed crops, reshaped geography, determined the fate of kingdoms. Controlling water became one of the central challenges of Chinese civilization. And what creature became most closely associated with water? The dragon. This connection was not arbitrary. The dragon represented mastery over forces that humans struggled to control. Rain, floods, rivers, storms, the very elements that could sustain life or destroy it. When emperors performed rituals seeking rain, dragons often occupied a central symbolic role. When drought threatened famine, dragon temples became places of prayer. The creature evolved beyond its possible biological inspirations. It became a way of understanding nature itself. But nature continued supplying raw material for the myth, and nowhere was that material more dramatic than in the fossil fields hidden beneath China's soil. By now, a pattern is emerging. Fossils may explain the dragon's immense size. Living animals may explain its behavior. Storms may explain its sudden appearances. Together, they form a surprisingly coherent picture. Yet, one critical piece remains missing. Because we still have not addressed the most controversial idea of all, the dinosaur connection. Whenever dragon legends and fossils appear in the same discussion, dinosaurs inevitably enter the conversation. The idea is irresistible. Ancient people discovered dinosaur bones. Ancient people believe in dragons. Therefore, dragons are dinosaurs. Simple, elegant, and perhaps too simple. Because reality is rarely that straightforward. The truth turns out to be both more complicated and more fascinating. Some fossils found in China genuinely belong to dinosaurs. Others belong to prehistoric mammals. Others came from ancient reptiles that were not dinosaurs at all. Different discoveries became grouped together under the same label, dragon bones. The result was a kind of accidental mixing of entire prehistoric worlds. Creatures separated by millions of years became neighbors inside human imagination. And that raises a question that scientists, historians, and folklorists continue debating today. Could repeated encounters with dinosaur fossils have directly shaped the dragon legend? Or were fossils merely one influence among many? In the next chapter, we follow the investigators who attempted to answer that question. Archaeologists, paleontologists, historians, researchers searching for precise point where myth and prehistory intersect. And what they discovered would force us to reconsider one of humanity's oldest monsters. Because the deeper they dug into the dragon mystery, the more evidence they found buried beneath the earth. Evidence suggesting that the roots of the legend may reach far deeper into the past than anyone had imagined. The dragon mystery chained forever because of pharmacy, not a mountain, not a temple, not an ancient manuscript. A pharmacy. At the end of the 19th century, scholars and physicians in China were still buying and selling what had been traded for centuries, dragon bones. The practice was ordinary, unremarkable. No one expected it to rewrite history. Then someone looked closer. Among the powdered remedies and fossil fragments were bones unlike any known modern animal. Some contained unmistakable signs of immense age. Some belonged to creatures that no longer existed. The realization spread slowly at first. Then, all at once, the dragon bones were fossils. Real fossils. And if those fossils could be traced back to their source, they might reveal entire prehistoric worlds hidden beneath China. Suddenly, the old dragon hunters had successors. Not villagers. Not herbalists. Scientists. Paleontologists. Researchers who began following the trail of dragon bones into the countryside. What happened next transformed our understanding of both dragons and dinosaurs. Imagine arriving in a remote valley after hearing reports of unusual bones. Local residents have known about them for generations. Children grow up hearing stories about dragon remains hidden in the hills. Farmers occasionally uncover them while digging wells. Collectors purchase them from nearby villages. To the local population, the bones are familiar. To scientists, they are treasure. This contrast appears again and again during the early years of Chinese paleontology. Researchers would arrive at locations long associated with dragon legends and discover something astonishing. The legends often pointed toward genuine fossil deposits. Not every story led to dinosaurs. Some fossils belonged to prehistoric mammals. Others belonged to ancient reptiles. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. Places famous for dragon bones frequently contained exactly what one would expect: enormous fossils. In a strange way, folklore had preserved geological knowledge. Generations of storytelling had quietly recorded where prehistoric remains could be found, without maps, without science, without anyone realizing what they were actually preserving. And then the discoveries accelerated. The early 20th century became one of the most exciting periods in the history of paleontology. Expeditions spread across China's vast fossil-rich regions. Researchers uncovered species unlike anything previously known. Huge sauropods with necks stretching toward ancient skies. Predatory dinosaurs equipped with powerful jaws and claws. Armored giants protected by natural fortresses of bone. Each discovery deepened an uncomfortable question: how many dragon bones had actually been dinosaur bones? No one could calculate the number. Centuries of collecting had erased much of the evidence. Fossils had been ground into medicine, stored in temples, traded between provinces, or simply lost to time. Yet enough survived to reveal an extraordinary truth. Ancient Chinese communities had almost certainly encountered dinosaur remains repeatedly throughout history. The implications were remarkable, not because dragons were dinosaurs, but because dinosaurs had been influencing dragon traditions long before anyone understood what dinosaurs were. For the first time, the connection between mythology and paleontology became visible. The dragon was no longer just a symbol. It became a clue, a cultural response to physical evidence. And then came discoveries that made the relationship even more fascinating. Because China's fossil record turned out to be unlike almost anywhere else on Earth, many people associate dinosaurs with giant reptiles, towering monsters, scaly predators, massive skeletons. But China would help reveal something entirely unexpected: feathers. Beginning in the late 20th century, spectacular fossils emerged from northeastern China. These discoveries preserved details so extraordinary that scientists initially struggled to believe them. Feathered dinosaurs, animals displaying features once thought unique to birds, species revealing evolutionary transitions with stunning clarity, creatures that reshaped our understanding of dinosaur biology. The impact on science was enormous. Entire textbooks required revision. Long-standing assumptions collapsed. New questions emerged. And strangely enough, these discoveries echoed something ancient. Traditional Chinese dragons had never been simple reptiles. They possessed characteristics borrowed from birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles alike. They blurred categories. They ignored neat biological boundaries. Of course, ancient artists were not predicting evolutionary theory, but the coincidence is fascinating. The natural world itself proved more complex than expected, just as the dragon had always been. Then another surprise arrived. Not all dragon bones were dinosaurs. This may seem obvious, but it complicates the story considerably. Throughout China, fossils emerged from different geological periods. A giant mammal might be discovered beside the remains of an ancient reptile. A prehistoric rhinoceros could appear in the same region as dinosaur fossils. Without modern dating techniques, these remains became mixed together. Everything large and mysterious risked becoming a dragon. This means the dragon legend may have absorbed evidence from multiple lost worlds simultaneously, not one extinct ecosystem. Many. Imagine assembling a creature using clues scattered across tens of millions of years. A dinosaur vertebra, a mammoth-like tooth, a giant antler, a crocodilian skull, an enormous fish. The resulting animal would be biologically impossible, yet culturally it might become a dragon. And perhaps that is exactly what happened. The deeper scientists investigated, the less likely a single explanation appeared. There was no moment when someone found one fossil and invented the dragon. The process seems far more gradual, far more human. Thousands of observations accumulated across centuries. Stories interacted with discoveries. Discoveries reinforced stories. Reality and imagination evolved together. Then came one of the most intriguing questions of all. Why China? Why does the dragon occupy such a central role in Chinese civilization compared with many other cultures? Part of the answer lies in geography. China possesses some of the richest fossil deposits on Earth. For thousands of years, people repeatedly encountered evidence of giant prehistoric creatures. That alone may have provided unusually fertile ground for dragon traditions. But geography cannot explain everything. Cultural interpretation matters. After all, different societies respond to mysteries differently. Some see monsters, some see spirits, some see gods. China saw dragons, and those dragons developed into something extraordinary, not embodiments of evil, not enemies to be destroyed, but forces connected to balance, prosperity, rainfall, and cosmic order. The same fossil discovery that might inspire a terrifying monster elsewhere could become a benevolent dragon within Chinese culture. The evidence was similar. The interpretation was different. That distinction matters because it reminds us that myths tell us as much about people as they do about the things that inspired them. The dragon reveals how Chinese civilization understood nature, not as an enemy to conquer, but as a powerful force requiring harmony and respect. And that perspective may explain why the dragon survived when so many other legendary creatures faded away. Science eventually challenged dragon biology. It did not challenge dragon meaning. Even after fossils received scientific explanations, the dragon remained culturally alive. Its symbolism transcended its origins. Today, the dragon appears on architecture, artwork, celebrations, and national symbols. Not because people believe dinosaur fossils are dragons, but because the dragon became something larger than the question of literal existence. Yet before we leave this chapter, one final mystery remains. After all the discoveries, after all the fossils, after all the scientific investigations, can we actually identify the real animal behind the dragon? The answer is both frustrating and beautiful. Probably not. At least not one animal. Every path we have followed leads to the same conclusion. The dragon appears to be a convergence, a meeting point where many realities intersect. Fossils contributed scale. Snakes contributed form. Fish contributed aquatic features. Deer contributed antlers. Crocodilians contributed power and behavior. Storms contributed drama. Mountains contributed mystery. And human imagination united them all. The dragon is not a mistaken dinosaur. It is something far more interesting. It is a map of human encounters with the unknown. A creature built from centuries of evidence, observation, misunderstanding, and wonder. Which means that after all our searching, the greatest revelation may not concern dragons at all. It may concern us. Because the story of the dragon is ultimately the story of what human beings do when they encounter mysteries too large to explain. And in the final chapter, we will discover why that story still matters today. Because even in an age of satellites, genetics, and paleontology, the dragon has not vanished. In some ways, it has become more powerful than ever. And understanding why may finally reveal the true creature hiding behind the legend. So, after thousands of years of stories, fossils, discoveries, and debate, we arrive at the question that has been waiting for us from the very beginning. Were Chinese dragons real? The answer depends entirely on what we mean by the word real. If we are asking whether giant antler whiskered dragons flew through clouds and ruled the weather, the answer is no. Modern science offers no evidence that such creatures ever existed. No hidden species, no surviving dragon population, no forgotten branch of evolution. The dragon of legend is not a biological animal, and yet that answer feels incomplete, because throughout this journey, we have uncovered something far more interesting than a simple myth. We have discovered that the dragon may be one of humanity's most successful attempts to explain a world filled with mysteries, a creature assembled from real observations, real discoveries, real animals, and real experiences. In that sense, the dragon is not false. It is a cultural fossil, a record of how generations interpreted evidence they could not fully understand. And when we examine that evidence piece by piece, a fascinating picture emerges. Start with the bones. For centuries, people throughout China uncovered enormous fossils from the earth. Many belonged to dinosaurs. Others belonged to prehistoric mammals. Still others came from ancient reptiles and extinct species that no human had ever seen alive. To modern eyes, these remains tell stories about deep time. To ancient observers, they told stories about dragons. This was not ignorance. It was pattern recognition. Human beings naturally seek explanations. When confronted with a gigantic vertebra larger than human head, they created a framework that made sense within their understanding of the world. The dragon became a bridge between observation and explanation, a way to make the impossible understandable. And remarkably, that explanation survived for millennia. Then there were the living animals, the crocodilians lurking in rivers, the giant fish moving through deep waters, the serpents disappearing into reeds and marshes, the deer whose antlers resembled living crowns, the powerful creatures capable of inspiring awe, fear, and reverence. None of them were dragons, yet all of them contributed something: a shape, a movement, a feature, a behavior. Over generations, these fragments merged together. The dragon became a composite creature, representing the most extraordinary aspects of the natural world. This process appears repeatedly throughout human history. The unicorn may have roots in encounters with rhinoceroses and misunderstood travelers' tales. Sea monsters often emerge from sightings of whales, giant squid, and unfamiliar marine life. Giants may originate from discoveries of fossil bones. But the Chinese dragon is unique because of its complexity. It is not based on one mistaken identity. It is based on hundreds, perhaps thousands, a collective portrait painted across centuries. And that may explain why it endured. Most myths remain confined to stories. The dragon escaped that limitation. Every flood could reinforce it. Every fossil could support it. Every strange animal sighting could strengthen it. The world itself seemed to provide continuous evidence, even when that evidence was misunderstood. This is where the dinosaur connection becomes especially intriguing. For years, popular media has often presented a simple idea. Ancient Chinese people found dinosaur fossils. Therefore, dragons are dinosaurs. It is an appealing theory. But the truth is more nuanced. The dragon is not a dinosaur. No known dinosaur matches a traditional dragon. No fossil species neatly explains the creature's appearance. What dinosaurs contributed was something arguably more important: scale. They supplied evidence that gigantic unknown creatures had once existed. Imagine living in a world where every visible animal fits within familiar limits, then suddenly discovering a femur larger than a man, a spine stretching across a hillside, a skull belonging to a creature beyond imagination. Such discoveries expand the boundaries of possibility. They teach people that giants once walked the earth. And once that idea enters a culture, myths gain new dimensions. The dragon no longer needs to be merely symbolic. It can become plausible. The fossils gave weight to belief, quite literally. But perhaps the most surprising revelation is that ancient people were not entirely wrong. Not in the way we often assume. Consider this carefully. When a villager found a dinosaur bone and declared it belonged to a dragon, the conclusion was scientifically incorrect. The bone was not from a dragon, yet the underlying observation was accurate. The observer recognized that the bone belonged to a gigantic unknown creature. That part was true. In fact, it was astonishingly true. The bone really did come from a creature beyond anything they had ever seen. Their mistake was not seeing something extraordinary. Their mistake was identifying what it was. And that distinction matters, because it reminds us that myths often begin with genuine mysteries. A strange footprint, a fossil, an eclipse, a flood, an encounter that demands explanation. The story comes later. The mystery comes first. The dragon, in many ways, represents the accumulated mysteries of an entire civilization. Mysteries preserved through art, literature, religion, and memory. Mysteries so compelling that they survived dynasties, invasions, revolutions, and centuries of change. Today, science has answered many of the questions that once inspired dragon legends. We understand fossils. We understand extinction. We understand geological time. We know that dinosaurs vanished roughly 66 million years before humans appeared. We can reconstruct prehistoric ecosystems with remarkable precision. Yet something curious has happened. The dragon has not disappeared. Knowledge did not destroy it. If anything, knowledge made it more fascinating, because now we can appreciate both sides of the story simultaneously. We can admire the mythology while understanding the science. We can see the fossil and the legend together. And nowhere is that relationship more visible than in modern China itself. Some of the world's greatest paleontological discoveries continue emerging from Chinese soil. Entire feathered dinosaurs have transformed our understanding of evolution. Ancient ecosystems are reconstructed with extraordinary detail. New species appear with astonishing frequency. Researchers continue uncovering creatures that seem almost mythical, creatures with bizarre crests, gigantic claws, towering necks, unusual armor, animals so strange that if their fossils have been discovered 2,000 years ago, they might easily have become dragons. In a sense, the Earth is still telling the same story. We simply interpret it differently now. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden within the dragon legend. Human beings have always been explorers, long before laboratories, long before universities, long before scientific journals. People observed the world around them and tried to understand it. Sometimes they were wrong, sometimes spectacularly wrong, but they were asking the right questions. What creature left these bones? What lives in the river? What causes a storm? What happened before humanity existed? Those questions eventually led to science. The desire to solve mysteries never changed. Only the tools changed. The dragon stands at that crossroads. 1 foot in mythology, 1 foot in natural history. Part symbol, part memory, part fossil, part imagination. A creature born from humanity's attempt to explain the unexplained. And perhaps that is why it remains so powerful today. Because beneath every dragon story lies something universal. The moment when a human being encounters a mystery larger than themselves. A giant bone emerging from a mountainside. A shadow moving through mist. A landscape hiding secrets beneath the earth. And the realization that the world is far stranger than it first appears. The ancient farmers who uncovered those enormous bones never learned about dinosaurs. They never heard the word paleontology. They never knew they were touching creatures separated from them by tens of millions of years. Yet standing on those wind-swept hillsides, staring at impossible skeletons emerging from the ground, they sensed something important. They understood that another world had existed before theirs. A lost world, a world of giants. And when they searched for a name powerful enough to contain that mystery, they chose the dragon, not because dragons were real, but because the mystery was. And in the end, that mystery may be the most enduring dragon of all.